Welcome, everyone, to Potholes in Politics, local Maine issues from A to Z.
I'm Neal Goldberg.
And I am Rebecca Graham. And we are doing an election-focused episode this week. So, Neal, talk about a couple of the interviews that you grabbed during convention that we're going to feature in this episode.
Absolutely. Well, I had the chance to sit down with many individuals, many municipal officials, state level officials, and just kind of informally talk about what's on their mind. And when you sit down with a clerk, one of the first things that they bring up is how much work goes into an election. In a typical election season, they're putting in hours every week. And as you lead up to the election, hours every day to make sure that this vital element to our democracy runs smoothly. So I had a great interview with Gillian Gaddis, the Deputy Town Clerk from Cutler, which we're actually going to play some excerpts from in just a moment. But she was talking about how much training goes into it and how much thought and how much scrutiny has come up recently in elections. And so that was a great segue into a later interview I had with Secretary of State Shenna Bellows, who is seemingly sort of on a road tour promoting all of the misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation that's going on around elections and what municipalities can do to combat that. And so two great interviews. We're going to play segments of both of those for you right now.
That's great.
This is Neal here again, live from MMA's convention. This time I'm sitting down with Gillian Gaddis, Deputy Clerk from the town of Cutler. Gillian, it's great to have you here.
It's good to be here, yeah.
I heard you're a relative newbie in Cutler. How did you wind up there?
I live in East Machias. I'm from East Machias. Actually, it's the current clerk who's getting ready to retire. She encouraged me to apply for that job, and I think you should be good at it. And she brought a packet to my house, and I filled it out and interviewed. It was a weird interview process, but here I am, Deputy Clerk.
And in just a moment, I want to bring up a conversation that we were talking about before we started recording. But before that, election season's coming up soon. What type of work does that entail for you in the office?
That, just to get off the ground, it's a lot of reading because there are very specific laws. And it's the type of stuff, it's public trust. You cannot F this up. Whatever it is you do, it has to be accurate. Mm-hmm. Whatever I touch, I put the date, the time, and my initials on it. Just Gillian was here.
And do you think it's always been that way, or is there more of a heightened sense of scrutiny?
I think you're right in saying that there's a heightened sense of scrutiny given recent events that we don't need to go into because everybody knows. But it's always been serious business. Election officials take their jobs very seriously. Like this is our whole country. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. We're based off this premise that everybody has a say, and that's the most serious of jobs, really. I mean, unless you're a surgeon.
No, you're giving voice to democracy, truly.
Right. Yeah. It has to be accurate. It has to be right. And you're a fool if you don't take your election job seriously.
Gillian, before I let you go, MMA convention, what's it been like? Has it been enjoyable?
It's been very enjoyable so far. The keynote speaker, first thing this morning, Rebecca Ryan, I think her name was, outstanding.
Good.
I could listen to that lady talk all day. She could read a phone book to me, let me tell you. I've been to a couple of classes that were interesting. One, I wanted to take a nap. I mean, it's a mixed bag.
Which, by the way, very much describes municipal work. A lot of it's very interesting.
Yeah.
But occasionally we all just want to take a nap.
Yes.
So I
could use a nap right now. Maybe a cocktail.
Hang around for just a moment. I think the bar opens up. But
nice. I think I only have the one drink ticket, though.
Darn.
Dang it.
If only there was a double registration. But
if only.
Gillian, thank you so much for your time and sitting down with me, and I appreciate this.
Hey, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Give us a listen, by the way. This is Neal Goldberg from day 2 of the convention here in Bangor, Cross Insurance Arena. I have a very special guest with me right now, Shenna Bellows, Secretary of State, here with us at the convention. Shenna, thank you for being here.
It is my pleasure. Municipal officials are such an important partner with the Secretary of State in the area of elections and, of course, Bureau of Motor Vehicles. I'm here today on the issue of protecting election officials, election security. We'll also be giving an overview of what to expect in the upcoming election, and it's just our pleasure.
That's certainly a hot topic issue. I mean, we know just from hearing from our members that increasingly they feel threatened or like there is some violence occurring around these elections. Is that real? Is that true?
Unfortunately, yes. What we have seen in the wake of the 2020 elections is the rise of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Lies being told about how elections are run that have incited people to threats and even violent acts. Across the nation, we heard this morning that 1 in 6 election officials have experienced some sort of threat from a member of the public. The majority of those come in phone calls, but they can also be in person, in the mail, and in other forms. So here in Maine, we've taken some proactive steps. We passed legislation in partnership with the municipal clerks to protect election workers and to provide training. Just this week, we provided de-escalation training for municipal clerks, and it's a very serious matter because, unfortunately, a threat on an election worker is a threat on democracy. The municipal officials, our local municipal clerks, they make our elections run. And our elections are fundamental to democracy itself and to everything we care about.
Wow. That is great to hear that there are some protections going in place. But that number 1 in 6, I mean, that is really telling. And that's almost 100 municipalities here in the state of Maine.
It's a national statistic, but yes, if you bring that out across the state, we do think that threats against election officials are probably underreported. We had 2 documented threats against election officials in 2021 that rose to law enforcement involvement, including prosecution in one of those cases that was successful.
Wow.
However, one of the conversations we're having today at the convention is municipal officials get used to abuse sometimes. You know, the angry customer, the hostile taxpayer. It's a fact of life. And so what we talked about is that when that escalates, when it rises to the next level, be sure to alert us at the Secretary of State's office so we can involve potentially a law enforcement response if it's warranted.
So along that line, MMA right now is doing some fact-finding on FOA requests and public access officers, and they are telling a very similar story, that they are the recipients of threats and workplace violence. And so has that reached your office yet, or is that still sort of bubbling up?
That also has reached our office. So again, the source of the problem is misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Conspiracy theories about our local elections, about local government, about how government works, that then fan the flames of people demanding information, sometimes about things that don't even exist in Maine. So we receive some of those records requests that are really absurd sometimes on their face because they demand records or terms that don't exist in Maine law, and sometimes they can have a very threatening tone as well. We're also seeing the emergence of the copycat record request, where on some of these fringe sites, Telegram, some of these fringe actors, QAnon, they will put out a call to action to encourage people to copy-paste a record request and send it to municipal clerks. So at the Secretary of State's office, we actually hired an attorney to assist us with responding to those elections-related FOA requests, and we've encouraged municipal clerks, if there's something that it seems to be a larger statewide issue, if it's terminology that is really confusing to the municipality because it doesn't seem to exist,
good afternoon,
they
everyone.
can reach out to us.
Hopefully you guys can
Well,
hear me a little better now.
that is good to hear that you guys are gearing up to help with that or to prepare for that. It sounds like the announcers just come on, and so we'll wrap it up here. But absolute pleasure to sit down with you. Thank you.
Likewise.
And good luck with the session today.
Thank you so much.
Neal, those were great interviews. And one of the things that I tend to do, as you know, in my off time is also do democratic governance work with a couple of international organizations. And because of that, our colleague Garrett said, you have to talk to this guy who presented during a simultaneous session that we had during the convention around elections that featured one of our stellar clerks, Patty Dubois from Waterville, and it was really focused on election security, harassment of election officials, and how to get more folks like Ms. Gaddis into the profession and build that next level or that next generation of clerks. And that was Chris Harvey, and he is currently the Deputy Director of the Georgia Peace Officers Standards and Training, which is essentially like our criminal justice academy. They establish all of the policing standards for peace officers in the state of Georgia. He had the distinct pleasure of being the elections director for the 2020 Georgia election.
That's an unenviable role, I have to say.
Absolutely. And there are some great anecdotes from the conversation that I had with him, and I could have literally talked to him for hours. He's extremely fascinating, but he brings up some key issues that we're going to be dealing with here in Maine. And it's about a new culture. And that is that municipal officials tend to just take complaints because no one shows up at the town office when they're happy. They're very used to folks that are angry and frustrated. So they take a lot of abuse that they don't necessarily have to. And elections clerks have not historically had to deal with that, but suddenly are now at the front lines. They're receiving horrendous threats via email, via phone messages. And that is likely or is expected to continue on the day. And it's a new reality for these folks. Because of that harassment, we've lost a lot of decades of experience. And Chris is really focused on ways in which we can stop that bleed and we can support and surround these folks and really inform the public about what it is that elections are, how they are managed, and how they are created, because it really needs a marketing campaign to understand its complexities.
Well, I'm excited for this. I can't wait to hear it because I heard at the convention he was a great presenter. And so without any further ado, here's Rebecca and Chris Harvey.
So I'm here with Chris Harvey, who is the Deputy Director of the Georgia Peace Officers Standards and Training Council. Is that an institute or?
It's a council. It's the state agency that certifies and sets training standards for all the peace officers in Georgia. Basically, anybody with a badge and a gun in Georgia.
Who has had an interesting path into becoming an election expert. Chris, I'd like to actually go back and maybe we've had a bit of a conversation here this morning, so we're off in a little bit of a tangent. How did you move from being like a homicide detective into an election investigator? Can you talk to me a little bit about that path?
Yeah, I started in law enforcement in 1994. I joined the DeKalb County Police Department, which is where the only county in Georgia where I've ever lived. It's basically Metro Atlanta. Fulton is sort of the western half of Atlanta. DeKalb is kind of the eastern half of Atlanta. And I started as a patrol officer, and about 2 years later became a homicide detective with that agency. Then went to work for the DA's office, working in homicides, and another DA's office working cold case homicide. And in 2007, I was kind of a little bit burned out on some of that stuff. So I called a friend who I'd worked with as a prosecutor and said, hey, I'm looking for another investigative job somewhere. And she had just been hired by the Secretary of State as their inspector general. And she said, well, I'm looking for a chief investigator for our office. Would you be interested in it? And I said, what do you do? I've never heard of the Secretary of State's office having a law enforcement division. She explained they do elections, they do licensing, they do some security stuff. And but it was probably mostly focused on elections. And I said, well, yeah, I'm interested. Let's talk. And so I ended up getting that job in August of 2007. And there was a lot of focus on election investigations. When I say investigations, it was investigating everything, even mistakes or accidents or allegations of fraud or systems not working right. And so I became the chief investigator there and was in that position for two different secretaries of state. And then in 2015, I was called over to the Secretary of State's office on a Friday morning, just kind of out of the blue, said, I need to see you, not knowing what to expect, and walked over. And the election director position, which is under the Secretary of State, also had been vacant for a few months, but I didn't think anything about it. And so he called me over and said, I want you to be the state election director. And I thought to myself, I kind of thought you were going to fire me for something. And as it turned out, that may have been the easier thing to take. But he said, look, you've been investigating elections for 7-8 years. He said you built relationships with all the counties, even though you've been investigating them, and you really have a good grasp on it. And he said, well, I don't think there'll be a lot going on in elections in the next couple of years anyway. So I said, okay, let me think about it. And I went home that Saturday. I called my father and said, hey, I got offered this position. I said, it comes with a raise. And the first thing out of his mouth was, you're going to earn every penny of that. He was right. And I think they still owe me money on it. But so I started in July of 2015 as a state election director and jumped into it. Georgia was at that time was not a huge election hotspot. It was a predictably conservative red state. And Republicans were in charge of everything, and that seemed to be what would happen, for the foreseeable future. Atlanta was growing, and we were getting a lot of people coming in, so the demographics were beginning to shift a little bit. And in that time, from 2015 through 2021, Georgia has become much more purple. It's still red, I would say, but with a strong purple tinge in places that has, as we've seen in the results of elections, have made it much more of a toss-up state than it was when I started in elections. And so, I went to work learning about how to run elections. And what I learned was that being an investigator of elections is sort of like being a defensive coordinator on a football team. Your job is to stop things from happening. And then becoming the elections director was like being the offensive coordinator. Now your job was to make things happen. You had to, elections don't just happen. You don't just pull up a calendar and say, well, this is going to happen. There's a whole lot of work and a whole lot of coordination that goes into that job. Georgia has 159 counties, which is the second highest number of counties of any state in the country except for Texas. And we're certainly not number 2 in population or in geography, but Georgia has 159 counties, all of whom Georgia is one of 5 states that has a uniform voting system, which means every county has to use the same equipment, the same processes, basically the same forms. So you're replicating something 159 times when you're running an election. I just kind of got down and tried to learn as much as I could, tried to talk with people that had been doing it for a long time and build relationships. And it was an incredible experience. It got a little more dicey than I would have expected it to, but I didn't think it was going to be easy when I started.
So counties run all of your elections there. Is there anything that happens at the municipal level with elections?
Some cities run their own elections. Cities have the option of running their own elections or contracting with counties to do it for them. I would say, and I don't have hard numbers on it, but I would suspect probably 3/4 of the cities contract with the counties to do most of their elections. Now, for a general election, for a state or federal election, the counties do all that. So you will have city elections that will take place concurrent with state and federal elections that are run by the county. So if a city were having a special election, 99% of the time, it would just be absorbed into the county election. But then in Georgia, in odd years, you generally have city elections. So the city of Atlanta, for example, when they have their elections in odd numbered years, they contract with Fulton County, which is the county which makes up most of Atlanta, and they run their elections. But there are other cities that run their own elections, and in some cases, there are slightly different rules for cities to run elections. So it's a little bit of a different animal, but it's probably 90% the same.
We are having a rise here in Maine of, I guess, a lack of belief that people who have been running our elections at the municipal level are doing so benevolently. And it has really shifted the culture here to one that is shaking up a lot of these really amazing unsung heroes who have been doing this for decades and decades and decades in their community. And it's not just that they're calling in their actions into question, they're being really vitriolic and hateful and creating a culture where people who have been doing it maybe for 50, 60 years are saying, I'm done. But there's not necessarily anyone behind that's getting involved and able to pick up and able to deal with these complex, often very laborious administrative checkbox type activities that have happened seamlessly and cranked over without a thought for so long. I think that there's a new need for us to kind of rethink about how we treat our public officials, but also some relationships I think that you are seeing now moving from police into elections with the intersection between election officials and law enforcement. We actually have some new laws here in Maine that prevent the harassment of election officials that previously didn't exist because of some of the really harsh harassment that they've been receiving and really unexpectedly. So would you kind of talk about that intersectionality between police and election officials and the need maybe for them to coordinate and understand each other a little bit better in order to kind of help protect this process rolling forward?
Yeah, it's a huge topic, and I give presentations, and I work with a group called the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, which is a combination of election and law enforcement people. And our job is really the motto is two words: it's connect and protect. Running elections is like running a railroad. It's kind of boring. It's not flashy. It usually doesn't have a lot of twists and turns. It's something that you can look at on January 1st and you can scope out the entire year, and you're going to have prescribed dates that these things are going to happen. And you've got a ton of stuff that has to happen before an election. A lot, like you said, a lot of checklists, a lot of kind of bureaucratic procedures. You've got to mail out absentee ballots, and you've got to test the machines, and you've got to order your ballots, and so you can backwards plan everything. We know if election date is November 8th, okay, 45 days before that, we have to send out the overseas ballots. And 30 days before that, we have to get the ballots from the printer. And 20 days before that, we have to have our ballot proofs in. And so an election official can basically scope out their entire year backwards planning stuff. Like I said, it's not particularly exciting or sexy, but it's stuff that every step has to be done. If you miss one of those steps, something's going to fall through and you're going to be in trouble. And when I give the presentation, I put up two pictures, and I have, and I'm in Atlanta, I'm in Georgia, and I say, elections are like NASCAR, and policing is like Formula One. NASCAR, you come there and you just go as fast as you can. You just keep turning left and do it 300 times. When you get in a Formula One car, you're going right, you're going left, you're slowing down, you're speeding up, you're passing, all this kind of stuff. And that's policing, because you start a day as a shift as a police officer. Your first call may be an armed robbery in progress, or it might be a cat up a tree, or it may be anything in between. And so you never know what's going to happen in law enforcement. You never know when the next emergency is going to happen. Well, elections, you kind of know where the critical spots are, and you know that you've got to have all the locations planned out. And so what this group and I have tried to do is to get the two groups in the same room and say, share with us what you need from us and how we can help. And we'll share with you from the law enforcement side how we can help. And it's not as simple as just marrying things up, because both groups are understaffed. Both groups are overworked. Both groups aren't fully trusted by the people that they serve. And in some places, and you have an unfortunate history of law enforcement at elections where it's not always a complimentary process. You go back 40 or 50 years, and not every police officer that was at a polling place was there to help people. And that's just a sad fact of history that has to be acknowledged. And some of that legacy still exists, and it exists in places like Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and other parts of the country. Everybody kind of has their own history, but it's about intelligent integration. Are we saying you need to have cops at every polling place? Absolutely not. Are we saying if there is a need for police at a polling place, could they be in plain clothes? Could they be behind the scenes? Could they at least know where all these places are, where every polling place is, where the election equipment is being stored, where the post-election events like audits and recounts are being done, so that they can know where they might have to deal with crowd control or angry people? Can they build a relationship with the election officials, so if they do get a threat, if the election officials get a threat, somebody calls them up and says they're going to kill them or sends them a threat, they know who they can call at the police or the sheriff's department and say, hey, this is serious. And law enforcement, this isn't just an idle threat. This is something that needs to be handled professionally and thoroughly. Because when you start attacking the people that are running the elections, who, in my experience, are some of the most earnest, hardworking, faithful people out there, like most of the cops I know, you're really attacking what makes our system work and what makes voting matter. And if you, like you said, if you get rid of all those good people that have been doing this for years, who's going to take their place? Are they going to have the same level of dedication, the same kind of experience that they're going to be able to preserve and keep the system running? Elections, most of the time I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, elections were boring. and I remember being in school and having the apathy, decried. Everyone was saying how voting, turnout was 40% or 50%. And, all these people had fought and died for our right to vote, and nobody was taking it seriously. Well, now we've got people taking it seriously, and our turnouts have gone up, especially in Georgia, which is a great thing. Mm-hmm. The problem is there hasn't always been a corresponding understanding of how the process actually works, and it's sort of an inoculation against some of these conspiracy theories and ideas that are out there that just simply aren't true or couldn't be happening. So we're hopefully getting these two groups of people in a room, having them learn about what the other's strengths and weaknesses are and where they can complement. And it has to be done early. You can't start it at 7:15 on election day in the morning. You've got to start planning months in advance, because that's how elections people operate.
Yeah, I think just getting the word out about this new law that has become necessary. I think even that, it didn't go into effect, until the end of March. I think April. No, I'm sorry. It may even be August. But there's a gap between that communicating that new law and getting it to the people that would have to be enforced or would be called up for that.
It's interesting in Georgia. There are about 15 laws that are sort of buried in the election code that I can guarantee no cop in Georgia has ever read in their life. I mean, my agency is responsible for setting the police academy agenda, and I double checked, and there's nothing in there about elections. But the law enforcement don't even realize what may be a violation of the law. Things like interfering with elections, interfering with election officials, intimidating voters. All that stuff is in the election code. It's not with the murder and the armed robbery and the rape and the theft and all the stuff that the police deal with 99% of the time. And 99% of the time, election stuff isn't an issue. But when election season comes along, those things become important. And with the heightened scrutiny, with the people getting involved, there's going to be more and more need for them to respond to those things. And if a cop doesn't know that there's actually a law against interfering with an election official, they're not going to be prepared to respond appropriately when that situation comes up. So that's another thing that we've done is we're generating law enforcement pocket reference cards that basically have the main election law violations that no cop has ever heard of, that we're distributing to law enforcement, so that an officer, gets this thing, and if they hopefully they'll go over it in training before the election. But if they get called to a scene, they can check the quick reference guide and say, "Oh, well, here's a code section that says it's a felony to interfere with an election official," and they can investigate and see if that's something that they need to take action on. And so that's been a huge part is educating law enforcement on laws that they don't know exists. I was at the Georgia Sheriff's Conference last week and had all the sheriffs in the room and just went through the laws one by one and said, these are the things that your deputies may encounter if they got called to a polling place. And I don't think, I don't know that most of the sheriffs had really ever seen a lot of those laws. They may have generally known about them, but it certainly wasn't something that they dealt with on a regular basis.
It's definitely a whole new set of violations that are occurring too, that have some crossover. I think in the case of Maine, have some crossover into hate crimes and some concerning potential groups that might be coming in and pose a threat to our election officials. I think there's a nexus, and they might know about that piece, but they might not see this crossover. One of the things that I'm constantly talking about, or you'll hear all my colleagues talking about, is that no one goes to the town office to give people hugs and cookies. Usually, everyone comes to the town office and they are mad and they are complaining, and the extent that they're complaining about is usually about state legislative stuff that has happened, but the only person that has been charged with doing that is the municipal official. So they're the problem. So there is this understanding, or maybe tolerance, of anger and, maybe not such polite conversations with individuals. So municipal officials are often real well-versed to dealing with complaints, which is kind of all they ever get. But this is a whole new kind of level of complaints. And you can arguably say that election clerks probably have never had anybody come in necessarily and complain to them. There might be a question about whether or not someone's on the voting list, but there's a mechanism for that as well to deal with it. But these are not people that have ever had a spotlight on them or attention. Everything that they've been doing has just been really, kind of not necessarily behind closed doors, but it's never been attractive, as you said. It's just functional, really important work that takes hours and hours and hours. So it's a whole new shift of energy for people that are already buried in this administrative process. It's super important and an incredible lift, often without a couple of days of sleep.
It's one more thing that's been put on them. If you look back to the 2016 election, when people started talking about interference and they started talking about hacking, and there was a real shift towards cybersecurity. At the federal level, at the state level, everybody was talking about cybersecurity. And that threat still exists. That's still something that has to be defended. And what's happened now is you've thrown sort of the personal security, the physical security on top of that. So nothing has been taken off. You just keep throwing more logs on the fire to a group of people that are already under the gun and trying to get something done. And then you add to that the perception among some people that the system is inherently flawed, or the system is inherently rigged or unfair. And they go looking for those problems, so that any mistake that any human like you or I make from time to time is then magnified and blown up, that something gets put in the wrong pile, and it immediately becomes not a human mistake. It becomes an intentional interference with the democratic process, or canceling somebody out, or and there's no room for human error. There's no understanding that sometimes things don't work perfectly, especially in an election system where probably 80% of the people that are doing it are essentially volunteers. I mean, the people that work at polling places, yeah, they're probably getting paid 10 or 15 bucks an hour, but they're essentially volunteers. And they're out there out of a sense of civic duty. They're out there, they're certainly not getting rich doing it. They're working, long days. They're putting up with, sometimes irritable people, but they're doing it because it's an important job. And you take any misstep that they make, or even a wrong word that they say, I had people call me that were complaining that the poll workers were wearing a particular shirt color and saying they were trying to subliminally influence them to vote a certain way because they had a red shirt or they had a blue shirt. And you just create this tinderbox. It's like a tinderbox with oily rags and a bunch, a sparking lighter, and all it takes is just the shift of wind, and it's going to go up like crazy. So you put all those things together, and gosh, who would want to work in a system like that?
Yeah, it makes
thank goodness there are people that do.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I'm so grateful. I am also keenly aware, I'm an election clerk in my community, that I'm definitely the youngest person in that room. And if these poor, largely women, have to continue to take this kind of abuse, they're definitely going to walk off. And I'm not sure who's going to step into that void, because we do, every single municipality runs an election here in Maine. And I think, I actually have never dug into, I should probably know this, but how they run them in the unorganized territories. It must be via the county level. But, you were lucky previously to have, maybe one half, if you were lucky, of the town show up to vote. That was a big day for for Edgecombe, that's like 2,000 people. No, I'm sorry, it's 1,000 people. We've got like 2,000 registered voters. And I can remember our clerk, because we were still using the same wooden box to deposit them in from the 1800s. And she was adamant, this is not going away. We are doing this forever. And then ranked choice voting came in, the machine came in, and she's like, all right, I give up, Fine, we'll do this. But that box still had also this touchstone reverence, like this is the same box that we've used for
the tabernacle of elections.
Exactly. Exactly. As we're going into this election session, we're going to try to do 2 different spots. We're going to do the before. We're going to talk with Secretary of State Bellows as well. And maybe if we can find a non-busy election clerk that we can grab in to talk about some of the concerns around the upcoming elections. And then we're going to do an after and try to do a debrief. I think this is going to be a new process for election officials, because it's going to be really important for them to actually report the threats and harassment that they've been receiving. And one of the key takeaways when we were actually trying to get that bill to pass was that we didn't really have the demographics to show that this was actually a problem, in a widespread problem, and not just like an isolated issue. And those telling of stories that happened at Patty Dubois and a number of folks that had received these threats started telling those stories, it made it okay for everyone else to say there was that acceptance that we're supposed to take this anger and vitriol. It's just kind of our public duty. So is there one piece of advice that you might have for election officials and clerks or registrars as in Maine as we go into this process, or even police, on being able to receive these types of complaints?
Well, when I was in Bangor 2 weeks ago speaking, and what I explained is I said threats against election officials are sort of the new kind of domestic violence. If you go back 20 or 30 years, that was one of the real difficulties that law enforcement had to deal with, because they would go to a domestic violence call and the woman would usually be beaten up and she would say, I don't want to press charges, and there wasn't anything they could do. And then it would just be a cycle that would just repeat itself and repeat itself. Well, the law changed, years ago in most states to require an arrest in a domestic violence case if there's evidence of injury or violence. And you took it out of the victim's hands and took it out of the abuser's hands too, and said, sorry, you make a determination and you're going to jail. And not saying that everybody needs to go to jail on election threats, but it has the same corrosive effect if the election officials just think it's their job to take it. And they're a pretty sturdy lot. I mean, the election officials in Georgia, I mean, they've got some thick skin. They've developed over the years. They've been through some battles, but nobody should have to take threats and harassment and things like that. So at the very least, report it and record it and save those voicemails and save those emails so that you can build a story and say, this is really a problem. Get it to law enforcement. Law enforcement hopefully will take it as seriously as a threat of an ex-husband threatening to kill his ex-wife. If somebody calls her ex-wife and says, I'm going to kill you, in Georgia anyway, that's a felony. That's a terroristic threat. If I call my county election official and say, you're a traitor, I'm going to come down there and blow your office up, I've committed a felony. That should be prosecuted the same way. So hopefully, we'll change the culture a little bit so that people understand you can't threaten public officials. You can't threaten election officials because you're unhappy with something that you think is being done or isn't being done properly. If there's evidence they're not doing something, if you've got proof that there's some type of fraud or abuse or something, then bring it to court. Bring that to law enforcement and say, hey, look, they're stuffing the ballot box. They're not letting people vote, and let that be investigated in court by competent authorities. So I would urge both sides to take the threat seriously, document them, and get a full picture of what's going on. Because right now, as you said, a lot of it is anecdotal because people didn't realize that they didn't have to put up with this kind of garbage. And so that's critical that we build a record and say, what are we dealing with out here? Because the Brennan Center has published some pretty sobering statistics about the number of election officials that have been threatened and the number of people that have left the elections world because of fears of threats. And I've spoken to several people that I worked with in Georgia that were county election officials that they said, I'm done. I'm tired of it. I'm not going to put myself through this anymore. And they walked away. And the tremendous amount of experience and integrity and knowledge walked out the door with them. And what's going to replace that? Who's going to replace that? Remains to be seen.
That's a really powerful analogy. I never really thought about it, but the domestic violence piece is a very cogent example.
And it's an assault against a basic foundation, our ability to have our voices heard. And regardless of the result, if people are exercising their constitutional right and voting, that's what you get is what you get. And everybody wants a level playing field, and everyone wants fair rules. And election officials, in my experience, do everything they possibly can to make it as fair and as legal as possible. They don't set the rules. They're generally set by the legislature or by state boards. So as Patty said at the conference, she said, "I enforce all the laws, even the dumb ones."
Yes, yes.
and that's the attitude that I think people have to understand. And take your concerns to your legislators. Take your concerns to the people that are giving these election officials their marching orders. They're doing the best they can, and they're operating within the rules that are provided to them by the legislature. So that's where the change needs to happen.
I often tell folks that if they think that any sort of election is rigged somehow, whether the town is small or large, go be an election clerk.
Exactly.
Election clerk, and just volunteer and find out what it's like.
Well, that's what I told people when I was the chief investigator, and people would talk about election fraud. And I said, look, the best defense against election fraud is understanding the system. Because if you understand how the system works and you understand what safeguards are in place, you'll realize that it's very, very difficult to do something and not have it detected. I mean, people are capable of anything. We know that. But to have it be undetectable in the election system is virtually impossible. It's just some of the allegations that have come out in the last couple of years just defy fact and logic that this stuff is happening. And we saw it in Georgia, tons of lawsuits. They were all dismissed after 2020 because there wasn't any evidence to support theories that people just spouted off, just pulling numbers apparently out of the air that, well, this many thousands of people did this. Well, who are those people? Well, we're not going to tell you. Well, okay, it's a little bit hard to investigate. There are allegations of I think thousands of dead people have voted, and I think they came back and determined that maybe 2 had, and those were people that had requested absentee ballots for people that had died or maybe died before the ballots. 2 out of 4 million is that's not lawsuit worthy material. That's certainly within the margin of human error.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much for coming up and talking to us at MMA's annual convention last week. Was it last week?
I think it was 2 weeks ago. It was August. It was October 5th through the 7th. I had a great time. One of my favorite moments was, I was talking about my experience in Georgia, and I said, the Deep South kind of has a different history than other parts of the country. And one of the local clerks stood up at the end during the question and answer session. He said, well, Maine is sort of the Deep South of the Northeast.
I have a friend who actually refers to it as we're just rednecks with snow tires.
I thought that's a pretty appropriate analogy. But every place is different, and there's not a single prescription that every city and every county or even every state can use. In some states, Massachusetts, for example, they're required by law to have a police officer at every polling place. Pennsylvania prohibits any police officer from being at a polling place unless they're responding to a call. So even, you can't say anything should happen because every state does it a little bit differently. And like I mentioned before, even individual places within states have different histories and different needs and different sensibilities. But nobody knows that better than the local election official and the law enforcement. They can work together and bring in community groups where appropriate. If there's a particular portion of the community that maybe has some concerns with security or with law enforcement presence, bring them into the conversation and say, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing what we're doing. And we hope you understand and give us some feedback that may help the situation. We're doing this because this is a reason. One of the fears in talking to law enforcement in trying to rev them up to get involved in elections is a lot of times cops think that the solution to a problem is just send a bunch of cops. More cops is the solution to the problem. And in some cases, that's true. Elections, not so much, because you may end up with some sort of oppressive or suppressive effect of that. But there are plenty of things that can be done behind the scenes in pre-planning that you can have a network in place so that if something happens, they can respond. They know the laws, and they know how to respond in a way that will be least disruptive and least likely to cause a problem with people voting. And they're happy to do that. And that's why it's real important that they election officials and law enforcement are sitting in the same room, and they're meeting each other, and they're knowing who they can call. So they're not calling over to some random officer at a screening desk reporting this. I encourage both agencies to designate a liaison. Hey, in the election office, if you got a problem with security or threats, Joe is the guy that's going to coordinate all those efforts. And Joe can call Lieutenant Smith at the sheriff's office or the police department, and they're talking directly so that things don't get lost in between. And some screening officer writes a report that never goes anywhere about a threat. But you've got a red line between the two groups that can talk immediately and make plans and coordinate.
Yeah, it just struck me too that planning thing will be really important in some of our larger communities as well, because we have mixed locations for polling places, and where those polling places are private or in a school, you can't bring your gun in with you to vote. But if it's in a town office, you can. So figuring out what's a threat might actually vary within a community based upon, someone not even thinking about it, but walking in differently.
It's interesting. In Georgia, we've got constitutional carry, which means you can bring a gun just about anywhere, except there's a state law that says you cannot have a firearm within 150 feet of a polling place anywhere. It doesn't matter whether it's a church or school or whatever. And again, that's something that probably not every cop knows is the case. And more importantly, most people don't know that's the case. So if you walk around with a gun everywhere and you go to vote, and you're not aware that it's against the law, and it doesn't mean that anybody who crosses the plane has to be tackled to the ground and dragged off to jail. But there needs to be an education and teaching people about these things. In Georgia, you can't wear a shirt with a candidate or a party who's on the ballot. But it doesn't mean you couldn't wear. I mean, if somebody were to vote this November and wear a Trump shirt and an Obama shirt, that's not against the law because they're not on the ballot. But you can't have a party. So if you've got Democrat or Republican Party on that is against the law. And again, the election officials know that. Very few people in the community know that, and cops don't know that. And so let's get everybody to learn these kinds of things, so you don't have problems blown out of proportion either. Like I said, you don't drag somebody off to jail because they wore a pin of their candidate. I mean, what do you do when you go to see a University of Georgia football game? You throw on a Georgia shirt. You go to a Falcons game, you put on a Falcons jersey. You're going to vote for your guy or your gal, you put on their shirt. That's what we do. Well, you can't do that. Imagine if they blocked everyone at Sanford Stadium that had a UGA shirt on and said, no, you can't come in here with that. Stadium would be empty.
It does kind of happen in New York, but Boston and Red Sox games, but that's another whole thing.
Yeah. We want to talk about New England sports and Atlanta sports. There's some bad history of this at a Super Bowl some years ago. I seem to remember.
Yeah.
It didn't turn out too well.
Did you investigate that one?
I see 28-3 in my sleep.
Yeah, we actually have the inverse here for we're also constitutional carry, but we have the inverse, so you can carry your gun into any place that isn't a school or a private building. They have the ability to say no. So like Bangor, the Cross Arena where we were a couple of weeks ago, that's a no. You don't carry your gun into there. They don't allow you to carry your gun, but that's a polling place. But town hall, you can. And we try to basically say this doesn't make any sense, because it's also it's a learning moment, because someone their polling place might change. They've voted at town hall and have never thought about not carrying in there, but now it's at another location that is a school, and they're just walking in, coming back from work or whatever, and this is hunting season as well, and not thinking about it. So it is that key learning moment.
Yeah, I spoke at the North Carolina conference, and they have the same situation. It's location dependent. There's not a statewide thing, and so even think about if you're talking to somebody, say, hey, yeah, I had no problem when I brought my gun to go vote. And that may be because you're voting in a particular place. And the other person who says, well, gosh, if Joe can do it, I guess I can do it. But you're going into a different place or a different county, and it may not be the same. So there's just a lot of moving factors in elections that that the public just doesn't get, because it happens. I think the public thinks that elections are kind of like Christmas decorations. You drag them out of the attic a couple days before, you just set everything up and you expect everything to work. And then you pack them back up and you throw them back up there for 11 and a half months, and it just kind of runs itself. Well, anybody that's worked in elections know it's a 365-day, 24-hour process that's always changing. You're always getting ready for the next one, or you're always doing something with the registration, or you're redistricting, or you're qualifying candidates, or you're doing challenges, or it's such a complex system that keeps changing. They keep changing laws, and we'll refine this and we'll change this, and it really is something that I hope as people get more active in elections, they'll really endeavor to learn more about what's going on, and hopefully election folks will have a little bit more time to get out into the community more and really educate people more. I called the social studies department chairman at the high school where my kids have attended. 3 have graduated, 1 is still a student, after I left the elections office, and said, hey, just so you know, I was a state election director in Georgia. People are talking about elections. I'd be happy to come to your classes and just talk about the mechanics of election. And I went over, I think I gave 6 presentations to auditoriums of students and teachers, and everybody was amazed at what happened and what didn't happen, and what could happen and what couldn't happen. And that was one person at one school, and we need people to go out and do that repeatedly, and we need people talk about a whole of government approach. Well, this is something that really, as people get more interested in it, as it becomes more consequential, we need to look at that kind of outreach a little bit more. But gosh, the election officials are so drowned in and people there's special elections going all the time, and there's training, and there's all this kind of stuff going on that we really need to have a lot more election education too.
That's something when I do OSCE missions, it is not the day is important. Election day is important, but it's you're in country for an extended period of time, up to 6 months, or there's a core team that's in there that's a little bit before the long-term team gets in there. But the points at which any sort of election can be interfered with are never necessarily on that day so much as they are in the lead up. And then the ability for folks to appeal those processes after. So the judicial, so it extends well beyond there. And, short-term observers might leave after the election day and they've seen that one single snapshot. That is not the whole story. The whole story is like, can you access appeals process? How does a candidate get on a ballot, and is that fair and equal? And those are the pieces that are really detail oriented, that happen, way outside the whole public process.
I can tell you on election day in November of 2020. We were sitting around the emergency management office, the state emergency management office, where we had our command center, and it was 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and we kind of looked around at each other and we said, that went pretty darn well. We had very few problems on election day. Everything seemed to work. You always have a couple things where something goes awry, but we thought, as crazy as we thought it was going to be, we thought, boy, we really dodged a bullet there. And that was at about 2 o'clock in the morning on the morning after the election. And it didn't really start heating up until about a week later, when all the votes were counted. And then it turned into just an absolute free-for-all. And, we had the Secretary of State under police custody. I had a police car in front of my house because I got death threats. Other people were threatened. And we went through the whole, what we thought would be helpful with a hand recount, with a machine recount, all of it done publicly in the hopes that it would get people kind of off some of these crazy theories. And it was marginally effective. It just, people wanted to believe what they wanted to believe, and they wouldn't be confused by the facts. And it turned into the tumult that is still going on in Georgia today, and will go on for the foreseeable future. I mean, that election is not over in Georgia. You got a grand jury that's convening in Fulton County that's investigating all that stuff. You got the Department of Justice is looking at stuff. And so they're still fighting that. You know, and sometimes in the South we tend to fight on after the war is over, but they're taking it to new levels in the 2020 election. And here we are. Advanced voting has already started. It started on Monday of this week. I'm probably going to go vote tomorrow, and so we're 3 weeks away or less from election day. So it'll and we've got very tight races in very important positions, and so there's going to be a lot of interest, a lot of scrutiny. There's been a lot of talk about the election laws that have been passed. There's been a lot of talk about lots of different things, and so it's still quite sporty down here in Georgia.
Yeah. So this is totally off topic, but I've been following the notion of a special grand jury, which I guess is what you guys have convened, and it's an advisory grand jury, and another grand jury would have to indict. And I was just kind of blown away by that process, that convening. Is it anything that you had to interact with at all?
Well, it's interesting. The first time, and the first time I got involved with special grand juries was back in 2000, I guess, 2000, when the sheriff of DeKalb County, where I lived, lost his reelection bid and assassinated his successor before he took office.
Oh my God!
He gunned him down in his front yard. And so they convened a special investigative grand jury. And what that means is that grand jury can do the nitty-gritty investigative work. They can subpoena people, subpoena documents, and they come to a conclusion that then gets presented to a regular grand jury that has the power to indict. So yeah, we worked that case for 2-something years, and eventually indicted him, took him to trial. He got convicted and is serving life plus 23 years in state prison. But that was my first experience with a special grand jury. And I was the lead detective on that case for the DA's office and shepherded all the way through the trial. And so this special grand jury that's in Fulton County now on the election thing started with the phone call, the famous phone call with President Trump and Secretary Raffensperger, and has now sort of expanded into other areas of the election thing. You know, their allegation of false electors that were put forth by one of the parties. There's the investigation into some machines in Coffee County, which is in South Georgia, that may have been connected to some of the campaigns. So I did meet with the investigators from that special grand jury and spoke with them earlier this year. It's still ongoing. I don't have any involvement with it. I don't know what they'll end up doing, but I know they're working. I know the district attorney. I worked some homicide cases with her back when I was working with Fulton County District Attorney's Office, and she's a tough woman. She's not afraid of anything, and she will not take no for an answer. I think she'll get to the bottom of whatever is to be gotten to the bottom of, and I don't know what that is, but she's a tough woman.
I was talking to a friend about like special grand that only gives advisory, and the comment was like, yeah, it's a grand jury that wants to be a journalist. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's not the worst analogy I've ever heard. Yeah.
So I was really kind of fascinated by that, trying to wrap my head around it. I want to do 2 things. One, thank you for your time this morning, and thank you for your willingness to do that and being part of MMA's annual convention. But I also want to wish you an amazingly safe and calm election, and I hope that that's what we have here too. And thank you for your work. It's absolutely unsung and totally paramount, because election clerks need a marketing campaign and don't really have time because we are relying on volunteers.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It was my pleasure to come to Maine. It was beautiful. The people were wonderful. It was a perfect time of year to go there. The leaves were starting to change. It was brisk, and I had a great experience there. And I'm happy to talk. And I try to take the opportunity to sing the praises of local election officials, because they're like the beat cop. They're the tip of the spear. They're the ones dealing with stuff literally hands on. And they often get vilified if they make a mistake or if something doesn't go according to perfect plan or perfect policy, and they get second guessed 20,000 times by 20,000 experts, but they're willing to go out there every day. And the election officials, every election, and do their sworn best to serve their constituencies. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for both groups, and I'm happy to bring them together because they're more alike than they know.
They are, and
they're both incredibly brave. They're incredibly brave people, and they don't get enough credit for that either.
No, they don't. And then you have to look at what they're dealing with now and say, yeah, it's a special kind of crazy that we really need more of. Pretty amazing. Thank you so much. I hope that we can get you on an OSCE mission.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to it. And thanks again for having me on. And if I can be any help in the future, give me a call.
Thank you, Chris. That's great.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Rebecca, that was fascinating. I love the way that Chris was able to use some pretty layman analogies to make this sink in for me, specifically what he said about elections as NASCAR, policing as Formula One. But something else that stuck out was what you had said just a moment before this interview, which is that election officials infrequently report this type of harassment or intimidation during election season. And that Chris was saying because of that, law enforcement officers actually don't really know the full extent of election laws and what securities that they're meant to enforce. And so there's sort of this chicken before the egg of, well, our law enforcement officers do need to brush up on that, which I know Secretary of State Shenna Bellows here in Maine is helping with her little SOS report card. But as well as election officials do need to report this more so that it reaches the level of law enforcement and they can start practicing those routines more frequently. Did any of that stand out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. The domestic violence analogy really stuck because that really drives it home. You're expecting that kind of behavior, not going to report it. But it also strikes me similarly within domestic violence situations is that it took a while for the response from police to be adequate enough to deal with those folks as well. And if there's a vacuum of knowledge of this new law, a knowledge or misunderstanding around whether or not harassment of an election official is permissible or not, any sort of gap in that, then the response might not be the best on the day, and that might actually prevent future reporting. So there's a nexus there, and I really like Chris's focus on these are folks that we got to get together. We've got to get speaking with each other and understanding because they both look at the same spaces differently, but they also both need a marketing plan that tells the complexities of their reality in a more tangible way because the public doesn't understand. They play Monday morning quarterback with both groups on a regular basis. And these are highly professionalized, integrity-filled, dedicated individuals that we don't want to lose. We want to cultivate more. We want to support.
Rebecca, how much of what Chris was saying do you think holds true apples to Maine? You had both talked about some state differences, whether it be the extent of concealed weapons at polling locations or even just the presence of law enforcement at polls on election day. Is what's happening in Georgia identical to Maine?
I don't think it's identical anywhere. I think the issues, as Chris had touched, are really situationally different, and they can be situationally different within a state. And it really is the same thing that we know with municipalities. These are communities, and they're communities that are shaped around touchstones within those communities and things that are important. Not every community is the same in Maine either. History plays a role in that. And there are places, as he touched upon in Georgia, that history is there, that is not an agent to assist you. And there has to be some sort of sensitivity. So one way to do that is to not put them maybe in uniform, but maybe to have them in plain clothes within those spaces, if that is something that a state wanted to enact. I know in the international context, there is always that balance as well. It is seen as an intimidation factor when there are, but there is that need to protect that integrity and to have that security because they're also, especially in post-conflict places, they're flashpoints and they are places that have some security. God forbid that ever happens here and we ever start moving to that. It seems a little crazy to me because this is about building similar structures after a conflict in the international context. But yeah, it's striking to me that there are these parallels that I'm starting to see with the way in which elections are being approached here. unlike that, the public really needs to understand those processes. And sometimes it's a lack of time between those changes. But as Chris pointed out, you actually have to understand the whole system, and that it's not, if there's 200 ballots in a box that shows up, that's catchable. That's, very clear. But it is worth looking at, how is it that candidates get on a ballot? Is that a fair process? How can you appeal a decision afterwards? Is that a fair process? Is that open to anybody, regardless of their abilities to engage with those processes or resources, I guess, behind that?
It always boils down to the same thing, which is educate yourselves on the laws.
Yeah.
I will say parts of this episode have felt a little bit dismaying to me. I mean, I think of elections as a time of hope, of change, of new possibilities. And to hear that there's so much workplace harassment going on, so much misinformation going on, it is troubling to hear. And so, with that as a note, I would say to everyone out there, register, vote, get in to see your town clerk. And by the way, when you're there to vote, say hello. Maybe give a smile to your local election worker at the same time.
Yeah, it's going to be a long night for them. And, to that point, I hope that they also feel empowered to make sure that they are reporting, at least, nothing else, saving those emails, saving those voicemails, so that the pattern can emerge and we can enact something a little bit stronger. The thing that pops into my head consistently when we look at the election officials and what happens within the campaigning sphere is this famous UK phrase, you campaign in poetry and you enact policy in prose. So the prose is the more detailed and very rubber meets the road activity that's happening within that polling station. They're going into extreme detail, but those campaigns are what is sucking the air and shaping that narrative. So it strikes me that this is what they're suffering from at this point in time. And it's harder to create a sound bite out of hard work.
Well, our hearts certainly go out to all the election workers out there. And if you are an election worker, reach out to us, Rebecca and Neal, at mmapodcast@memun.org. Share your election stories with us, your hopes and your dreams. We'd love to hear from our audience.
And mostly know that we are feeling for you, understanding. And I'll be in the polling station on the day. Neal, are you volunteering?
I went in to offer, but the two clerks there have it all covered. They said they didn't need any volunteers, but I will be there on reserve if they need anything.
That is awesome. And I would encourage everyone else to do that too.
Well, this has been another great episode, Rebecca. I'm excited we did it, and we'll be doing a follow-up, I believe, after the election, if that's correct.
Yes, I'd really like to get Patty Dubois in, and hopefully she'll listen to this episode and agree. But I'm definitely going to be hunting her down to tell her that I appreciate her efforts, but also to talk to her about the law that she was really instrumental in getting passed. That is the feature of this mechanism, so that we can start collecting some of that information and get a debrief as to how everything went after the elections. Hopefully everything is absolutely fine.
I'm sure they will be. But till next time, till after the elections, this is Rebecca and Neal signing off.
Bye.